You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 418 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about impeachment, Bolivia, and Afghanistan. You find the show online at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and the daily news roundup that I write are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Share the show from there. If you're a new listener to the show, subscribe to it somewhere. It's up everywhere people listen to podcasts. And if you really want to help the show out and donate, you do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first thing I'm talking about today's show is impeachment. I believe I've said this before, but I've gone back and forth on how much of a foreign policy issue this really is. With Russiagate, where it was a very clear, I think, foreign policy issue because the attack and the line from the number Trumpers was that Russia hacked our elections and attacked our democracy. It was compared to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And this, all these claims that was creating all this hysteria and bad tensions between the world's two largest nuclear superpowers needed to be attacked and debunked. And because there were so many lies, I had spent so many shows on it. Now with the Ukraine issue, a large part of the time I feel like this is just kind of domestic politics. Like the Democrats have from day one wanted a reason to get Trump out of office. And, they finally found their excuse that they're sticking with, and that's, this Ukraine business. So if it's just kind of, this political attack against Trump, I don't want to get into all the little details of what's going on in the hearings. But at the same time, one thing that seems more and more noticeable to me is that there's a reason that Ukraine is what they're using to target Trump, and that is the Ukrainian NATO membership. And so, you're seeing several of these people who are definitely long-standing U.S. officials. Some people call them deep state actors. Likely this is in some cases true and maybe in some cases an overstatement. But people who are generally invested in expanding the U.S. empire, are these kind of people coming out and claiming that Trump made this quote quid pro quo with Zelensky. But they're emphasizing here that the U.S. relationship with Ukraine is really important, and that's because of, the relationship with Russia and Ukrainian NATO membership, which of course is something that Russia has said is a red line for them, and they're not, absolutely not going to let the United States absorb Ukraine into NATO. So I did want to mention that because it's what everybody's talking about, and it's in all the news stories right now. I was at like a work function, and every TV is, at the place we were at is tuned in to, C-SPAN, CNN, MSNBC, no Fox News, but all the left-wing sites. And, they're just kind of like constantly constantly have the testimony on. So, I did want to weigh in the sense that I think it does affect foreign policy here. I also think there's some just good exposure of, kind of what the U.S. empire is and how the sons of the vice presidents and all these connected men, after they create instability and coup d'etats, suddenly get positions on important board memberships because the U.S. is super influential in the country. And they know that, if they have the vice president's son on their board, they're more likely to get, the contracts and the permits and, not be put on any blacklist by the U.S. government or anything like that. So they get everything they need. So there's that kind of corruption exposed in this as well. Overall, I think this is a losing issue for the Democrats. And reason number one is they don't have any solid evidence. Very similar to Russiagate, what I'm seeing here is that they have all these people who are long-standing U.S. government officials, people of the, adults in the room, the deep state establishment figures who are coming out and saying, oh, Trump did something really bad here. And we know it because we heard this other guy say it. But nobody is actually coming out and saying that, hey, Donald Trump ordered me, or I heard Donald Trump say to the Ukrainian prime minister, you must investigate the Bidens if you want this military aid from the United States. So unless the Democrats have that, I think it's ultimately a losing issue. And much like the Russiagate issue, a certain number of people, because it's endorsed by the Democratic Party, are going to believe everything that, these figures say. And, a certain percentage of the population, is going to disbelieve it because, they didn't buy into the Russiagate stuff. And again, there's no firm evidence. And it's probably the side you have to err on, if you're actually looking, did Trump, violate the law and, would he be convicted in court or something like that? Now, of course, the issue that I've long said here is that I'm just super disappointed because the Democrats could really use Yemen, use any Trump drone strikes, especially outside of Afghanistan, all the bombing in Syria, supplying arms to Ukrainians, in the military there when there's known ties to neo-Nazi militias. So there's a whole list of things that I would be just fine. And I think there's evidence to support what the Democrats are trying to do in an impeachment. And this Ukraine business just isn't the case. And again, I don't know if it's the root cause of the NATO membership or just something that people are seeing to exploit who want to expand, NATO membership to Ukraine. But it really does seem like that's what a lot of these people who are bringing up the issue are saying, that, the relationship with Ukraine is too important for this nonsense. We have to get, NATO membership there. I believe there's even some people who kind of have come out and said like, hey, there's this U.S. foreign policy for Ukraine, and then there's Trump's foreign policy. Like the commander in chief isn't entitled, to direct, his foreign policy here. All right. Well, enough of that. And again, as that issue runs into foreign policy, I'm going to cover it, but I'm not going to go through all the little kind of trivial congressional motions and political stuff. It's too detailed and I don't want to pay attention to it. And at the same time, I don't ultimately think anything's going to come of this or it really means anything. So with Bolivia, there was a coup. And while that certainly isn't what's being reported in the mainstream media, even, if we could, have a discussion about if that coup had U.S. backing or something like that, nonetheless, it seems like the military leadership and the police of that country forced the same President Morales out. So there's some debate that people are bringing up if Morales should have been the sitting president of Bolivia. There's two reasons for this. One is they say he violated term limits. Although if you read the arguments from both sides of the issue, one side will say, well, he violated term limits, and I forget if it's the court or the legislator upheld that, yeah, he cannot run for a fourth term. But then you read the other side and they say, oh, actually is the opposite one. The courts or the legislator said that was okay for him to run for a fourth term. So, I'm not even going to pretend to understand the Bolivian constitution well enough to make a call on if this guy should have been allowed to run for a fourth term or not. But he did run in the election and, got the number of votes that he, claims to have gotten, which is the next issue, is if the election was fair. So at least it doesn't seem to me that there's a real attempt to remove Morales from office until the OAS comes out and says, he cheated in the election. So this is the claim, that the election's going on and they're counting the votes and then they stop counting the votes. And then after that, Morales received enough votes so he would outright win the election. The way the Bolivian election system works is that you have to get a certain percentage more than your next opponent, and you also had to get a certain percentage of the vote. So whatever happened after the system, stopped and then restarted meant that Morales was able to clear that threshold and win the election outright. Whereas before, I believe he was going to, win the election, but then have a runoff. So, that does seem to arise some suspicion, but there is this DC-based think tank, the CEPR, that came out and said, well, we can actually explain what happened there. Morales' base, I believe, is fairly poor and lives in rural communities. And so, these votes just tend to come in later than the votes for, the opposition, where the people lived in cities and more urban areas, and their votes were counted faster, and that's the explanation for that. So, that seems fairly reasonable to me. I'm pretty skeptical of anything the OAS puts out. This is an organization that was put together by the United States to exert power over Latin America, and they have, really done so with this. And I believe the OAS still gets a large percentage of its funding from the U.S., but at the start, I believe they were getting like over half, 60% or so of their funding from the OAS. So again, after the OAS puts out this statement, the military makes calls for Morales to step down. He offers to hold a new round of elections, but the military and the police, I'm seeing these two lumped together when it's explained, continue to threaten Morales. I believe some of his followers and some of the actually government officials from his party have been arrested. He, at one point, I believe, had arrest warrants out against him. I was very concerned that, this guy was going to get killed. Not that I know he's a great guy or anything else like that. He's a head of state, so I assume he has some corrupt tendencies and everything, but certainly, murdering him in the streets probably wasn't the way to make the people of Bolivia more free. So after he resigns, he seems to face legitimate possibility that he could somehow be detained, arrested, or killed, and he ends up taking asylum in Mexico. It's worth mentioning that it seems like to me Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Argentina are the countries coming out in support of Morales, whereas, the United States and Brazil seem fully on board with, the coup attempt there. With the next two people in line of secession in Bolivia also resigning, a senator named Jeanine Anez claimed and asserted herself to be interim president, although that vote that happened had some procedural issues because they didn't have quorum. So it seems that her claim to authority is probably lacking a little bit at this point. And I think that, takes us up to about where I understand the situation is in Bolivia now. People are protesting and, demanding the return of their leader. But it's always hard to tell, whose protests are bigger, and where the popular support lies. But, getting a better idea over if the OAS or CEPR has a better take on the election and how, rigged or not that was, may, shed some light and understanding on what exactly is going on here in Bolivia and how much support Morales has. So it does seem that a lot of the opposition to Morales has ties in the United States. There's several articles, being kind of, I think, researched now and put out. I would look at the Gray Zone. Matt Blumenthal and Ben Norton had a good article out the day of this and basically showed that, this right-wing opposition to Morales at least has some pretty radical and unsavory elements. A lot of these South American countries have different ethnic groups, and like elsewhere in the world, these ethnic groups have tensions. And so I think, there's some racism, especially directed at Morales and his followers. I believe he is, I don't know what the term that they use is, but like of a native population, whereas the opposition is mainly of people of European descent, and so that changes how I guess people feel about things in these South American countries, and is one of the divisions and the reasons that Morales was president. There's also the left-wing issue, so I'm guessing that maybe some people will be like, oh, Kyle, look at you right now defending, the left wings and the commies, and, this was a right-wing government overthrowing a communist dictator. I don't know how much this, guy was a dictator or how brutal he is, so I can't weigh on anything like that right now. People on the left are pointing that, oh, hey, look, the economy in Bolivia got a hell of a lot better once this guy became the leader. It seems like, probably a couple of things happened. One, even if he's more left-wing, that doesn't mean he's not stealing less money than, a right-wing fascist type government would. And like I said, if you check out that article by Ben and Matz, you'll see that the opposition there definitely has some pretty nasty elements. And so maybe they're just stealing more of the money from the people. And since this guy is, now taking, the 90% that was being stolen by the elite, and now the government's stealing maybe 70% and he's giving 30% to the poor people or something like that. And so that it does seem like, poverty and illiteracy have gotten somewhat better in Bolivia under this guy's rule. Again, that's, nowhere near an endorsement of communist policy. Just imagine how well it would be doing if they had legitimate free markets rather than a choice between the commies and the fascists. Two worst choices that, you can hardly imagine for a libertarian. So, on that kind of issue, that's where I'm coming down on it. And yeah, I do suspect that if the U.S. didn't have a whole lot of, fingers in the pie of the original coup attempt, we're now looking to insert ourselves there and seeing an opportunity in the chaos to, extend the reach and the power of the American empire. So probably more on that in the shows to come. Moving on to Afghanistan, there's been some talks that Afghanistan will release 3 important Taliban members, including the second in command of the Taliban and the leader of the Haqqani network, in exchange for an American and a Australian professor that were abducted from American University in Kabul, I believe a couple years ago now. They've been in captivity for quite some time. I believe Haqqani, if he ends up being released, would actually be a part of the negotiation team. If they're negotiating with the Taliban, the Afghan government, or the Taliban, the United States. So possibly, I guess, it seems like that's a step in direction towards diplomacy rather than war. Although it says, I just read right before I went on air on Reuters that this isn't going to happen now. So, that's disappointing, but maybe it, ends up getting back on, or they figure out whatever kinks are still in the pipeline here. The U.S. came out and announced their support for this. So, I thought that was a good sign. Unfortunately, in Kabul, another car bomb goes off, 7 more people dead. And of course, this is all of the war around the U.S. nation building project in Afghanistan that still, after all these years now, 18 years, can't figure out how to hold an election. It's been, I guess, a couple months since the election in Afghanistan. We still don't know who the winner is. Both sides are claiming a victory. The vote has been delayed, I believe, twice now, the results announcement. And the day was supposed to be tomorrow, and November 14th, that we're finally going to know who won this election. And then it gets postponed. So, in a country and, in a society like Afghanistan, the Taliban and the rural areas there, where, Michael Hastings in his book kind of documents how the people didn't really see the purpose of the elections anyways. You now have an election that's getting delayed several times. Everybody's claiming to have won the election. There's arguments over what votes should count because they didn't have the right biometrics and stuff. The whole thing's a huge mess, and just shows how big of a failure U.S. policy has been. Before I wrap up, I just want to mention that there's some increased fighting going on in Israel. At least 23 have died in the fighting since Israel carried out a targeted strike against the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who was living in the Gaza Strip, and also attempted to kill I don't know if it's the second in command, but another high up of the group in downtown Damascus. Ended up that airstrike hit a building and killed a couple of kids. Very unfortunate there. So, of course, no matter how many innocent people the Israeli airstrikes or the Israeli bullets into Gaza seem to kill, I'm talking about the people that died in downtown Damascus. At least the leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I would suppose, would at least consider himself a combatant, although his wife was killed in the strike. So, there's no accountability for that. And, there's talks of more fighting coming from the Palestinian side in Gaza this time. I guess for whatever it's worth, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was voting on whether or not, I guess, to, carry out a larger conflict in Israel. In response, of course, Gaza has fired rockets into Israel. Israel claims to be intercepting about 90% of these, maybe some injuries, but no deaths from the Palestinian rockets. All right, everyone, that's where I'm wrapping up for today. Hope you're enjoying the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Go to Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook.com. There's a private group, Foreign Policy Focus, Patreon.com/Foreign Policy Focus.